It's late, and the candles have burned to their quiet ends. You're listening to the sleepy historian. Outside, the world hums faintly, but here, only the past whispers. Tonight I'll tell you of medieval minds who tried to make life safer, and instead made it infinitely stranger. They meant well, most of them. That's the tragic charm of medieval invention. Almost every terrible idea began as a good one. You see, the Middle Ages were full of peril, falling roofs, open fires, plagues that lingered like gossip. And somewhere, between candlelight and catastrophe, people began to dream of safety. A safer candleholder, so it wouldn't fall and ignite your hay roof. A safer bridge, so the cart wouldn't collapse into the moat. A safer potion, to keep illness away. But the problem with safety in the Middle Ages was that no one really knew what safety meant. Take, for instance, the fireproof cloak. Invented, supposedly, by a monk in the 13th century who had seen too many of his brothers catch fire during evening prayers. The idea was noble, a garment soaked in vinegar, lime, and divine blessing, said to resist flames. But when tested, well, one novice monk went up like a divine torch. It turns out vinegar makes cloth more flammable when heated. The chronicler wrote, mercifully understated, Brother Matthew's faith was proven beyond earthly endurance. The monks tried again, of course. They always did. In those centuries, fear and curiosity walked hand in hand. If you feared drowning, you built a floating contraption from sheep bladders. If you feared illness, you wore herbs around your neck until you smelled like a walking kitchen. If you feared demons, you hammered iron horseshoes above your door. All of these, safety inventions. All of them, tinged with horror when seen in the right light. The truth is, every medieval safety idea began as a prayer and ended as a lesson. Safety wasn't yet science. It was superstition dressed as innovation. And for every bright thought that saved a life, another one snuffed a candle too close to the drapes. Tonight, I want to wander through that world. Through the villages and monasteries, through blacksmith shops and plague lanes, where people whispered to one another, "Don't worry. I've made it safe now." And history, smiling thinly, wrote, "It wasn't." Let's start with the simplest of medieval fears, fire. It haunted every home, every castle, every humble kitchen. And so, of course, someone tried to make fire safe. They called it the Iron Hearth Guardian, a sort of metal angel mounted above the fireplace, arms outstretched. It was meant to reflect heat back into the room and prevent sparks from flying. But the blacksmith who designed it sculpted the angel with hollow eyes, open to the chimney's draft. At night, when wind blew down the flue, those eyes would whistle, long, low, mournful sounds. Families swore they heard words in those whines. Some said the angel whispered their sins back to them. Soon, no one wanted an iron guardian. The safest hearth in the village sat cold. You see, safety and fear were twins in the medieval mind. Anything designed to protect could just as easily be cursed. A blessed charm against fever might be a demon's calling card. A helmet meant to prevent skull fractures might trap a soul if it died inside. Every act of prevention came with a story of punishment. And yet, they kept trying. Because in that age, safety was not comfort. It was faith. And so begins our journey, through smoke, through iron, through herbs, through prayers. A long walk through the strange inventions that were supposed to save lives. And the horrifying tales of what happened when they did not. There is a story told in an old English village, though no one remembers which one anymore, about a bridge that was built to keep people safe, and instead, took more lives than the river ever did. It was a simple crossing, of course. A plank bridge over a slow, muddy stream, just deep enough to drown in if you had the misfortune to fall. Children used to run across it on their way to the mill. Farmers led their oxen there after market days. And when the rains came, as they always did, The river would rise and take the bridge with it. After one particularly bad flood, the local lord, a man with an unfortunate fondness for being remembered, decided he would build something enduring and safe. He hired a mason from the next shire, a man who claimed to have studied Roman methods, which usually meant he'd seen a broken aqueduct once. The mason promised a bridge that would never fall again. It would be made of stone. Its arches, he said, would defy even the angriest flood. And so, with great ceremony, they laid the first stones. The priest blessed it. The villagers watched. Even the old women, the ones who usually muttered about curses and omens, seemed impressed. But when they finished it, the bridge looked wrong. Too thin, too high, like something built for ghosts, not people. Its arches were narrow, its stones sharp-edged and white like bone. And when the wind blew through, it made a sound, a hollow, breathy tone that seemed almost human. The first person to cross it was the mason himself. He took 3 steps across, smiled to the crowd, and then the middle arch gave way. They found him downstream, his tools still clutched in his hand. The unbreakable bridge collapsed around him. The Lord was furious. He ordered another bridge built on the same spot, but this time, the mason's apprentice took over. He was younger, humbler, and, perhaps, more afraid. He whispered charms into the mortar as he worked. Little prayers, little bargains, just in case. And this one stood. For years it stood. But the people refused to cross it at night. They said the bridge moaned. Not from the wind, as before, but from inside the stone. Like a voice remembering how it fell. And here is where the story takes its strange turn. During another flood, many years later, when the water again rose past its banks, the villagers saw something miraculous. The bridge did not collapse. In fact, it broke itself, neatly, deliberately, in the middle, so the rushing water could pass through harmlessly. When the flood subsided, the two halves still stood, connected by nothing but a narrow leap. No one could explain it. The priest declared it divine intervention. The blacksmith called it impossible geometry. But the old women, the same ones who had muttered at the first bridge, said softly, "It learned." They never rebuilt it. They left it in its broken form, half standing, half forgiving, a monument to a safety invention that saved lives by sacrificing itself. And so, in medieval Europe, bridges began to carry superstition as much as stone. Every safe crossing had a spirit, they said, a soul trapped within, sometimes kind, sometimes vengeful. Travelers left coins at their ends or whispered apologies before stepping across. If a bridge had taken a life once, people trusted it more. Because it was sated. It seems strange to us now that something built for safety might be treated with the same fear as a ghost. But that was the rhythm of medieval thinking. Every protection required a price. And sometimes, the price was simply belief. The chronicles are full of such contradictions, inventions designed to preserve life that seemed to bargain with death instead. Helmets that suffocated knights. Walls that collapsed from the weight of their own protection. Locks that trapped more people in than out. The bridge that broke to save lives was only one of many. It was part of a pattern, a quiet truth whispered through centuries of trial and error. Safety, in the medieval mind, was not the absence of danger. It was the art of keeping danger busy somewhere else. And as we leave the bridge behind, the water still murmuring below it like a memory, we walk toward another well-meant horror. This one smaller, simpler, and far more personal. It sits not on a riverbank, but beside a cradle. A little invention meant to save babies from the cold. An invention that, like so many others in that era, nearly undid the thing it was meant to protect. In a small cottage somewhere on the edge of what we now call France, though no one back then agreed exactly where France began, there once sat a mother who feared the cold more than death itself. And who could blame her? The medieval night was no gentle chill. It was a creeping, bone-deep cold, the kind that reached through cracks in the wattle walls and stole the breath from the very young and the very old. Winter was not a season, it was a siege. And so she did what mothers have always done. She improvised. The story comes to us through a 14th-century parish record, written in the uneven hand of a sleepy village scribe. It mentions only briefly the child lost to warmth, and the device thereafter forbidden. No details, no sketches, just a sentence heavy with regret. But over the years, the story grew in retelling. They say she built it out of love, a cradle unlike any other. Not the usual wicker or oak, but wrapped in layers of wool, stuffed with straw, and sealed tight with animal fat to keep the drafts out. A soft little world, insulated and perfect. And yet, it was too perfect. No air moved inside. The breath that entered could not leave. The warmth that comforted also consumed. When neighbors found the baby, the cradle was still warm to the touch. The candle had burned low. The room smelled faintly of tallow and silence. It's easy, centuries later, to call that tragic. But it was also, in a grim way, progress. Because out of that sorrow came the first rudimentary attempts to understand safe sleeping. Mothers began to leave a little space open at the side of the cradle. They drilled tiny holes in the lids of wooden baby boxes. And in some villages, blacksmiths even forged thin metal rods to hold blankets above the infant's face, like a miniature canopy. The cradle that smothered gave birth, quite literally, to the idea of ventilation. And yet, as with everything in those days, good ideas traveled strangely. One region called it the breath cradle, and used it widely. Another outlawed it entirely, believing the holes let demons enter. In some places, mothers hung garlic over the holes. In others, priests blessed them with salt and holy water. What began as a tragedy slowly turned into a ritual, the ritual of safety itself. Because in the Middle Ages, every invention that claimed to protect life needed both science and superstition to survive. One without the other simply wouldn't do. There's a curious detail in one later account, a monk's journal from the Abbey of Saint Honoré. He describes how, after hearing the tale of the cradle, his brothers debated whether God intended humans to interfere with nature's dangers at all. If a babe is meant to live, one argued, it will live. If not, no cradle will save it. To which the abbot replied quietly, then perhaps God sends the cradle to see if we are paying attention. That line still feels modern, doesn't it? That delicate balance between fate and invention, between faith and the first stirrings of scientific care. Medieval people did not lack intelligence, only information. And in the absence of data, they filled the silence with stories. From this one mother's attempt to ward off death came hundreds of variations, swaddling rules, nursery blessings, even the first safety prayers recorded in parish books. Every invention was a memory of someone's mistake, turned gently into wisdom. So, if you listen closely tonight, really listen, as the wind hums past your window, you might imagine the faint creak of that old cradle. It doesn't sound sorrowful anymore. It sounds like learning. The slow, patient kind that comes only from love, and loss, and the fragile hope of doing better next time. And as the mother in that nameless cottage laid her next child down, she left the blanket just a little looser. A little air, a little breath, a little grace. And that, too, was a kind of miracle. Now, if we step quietly from that candlelit cottage and walk through the narrow lanes toward the sound of hammering, we'll find another medieval attempt at safety. This one forged in iron, gleaming, almost noble. A contraption designed to protect a knight's head from harm. And yet, as so often happened back then, it did precisely the opposite. There's a kind of irony only the Middle Ages could perfect, where the very thing meant to save a man's life was the instrument of his doom. Such was the case with the infamous Angel Helm of Sir Gervase de Montfort. Sir Gervase was a knight of unimpeachable reputation, which is to say, he was loud, proud, and rarely right. He fought in the service of a minor lord who fancied himself descended from Charlemagne, though his only clear inheritance was a chronic lack of funds. And so, like many knights of the 13th century, Gervase had to buy his own armor, or rather commission it. Armor was a mark of wealth, as much as protection. A knight's gleam was his glory, his steel an extension of his ego. And Gervase, with his vanity polished brighter than his sword, wanted the finest helm in all of Burgundy. The blacksmith he chose was one Etienne du Lune, a craftsman more dreamer than engineer. Etienne was known for creating armor so ornate it bordered on absurd, helmets carved with angels, visors shaped like animal snouts, and one memorable breastplate in the likeness of the Virgin Mary, which the bishop ordered immediately destroyed. When Gervase came to him with coin and ambition, Etienne's eyes shone. He promised a design unlike any other, a helmet both divine and deadly beautiful. And thus began the legend of the Angel Helm. It was forged from layered steel, with filigree wings rising from either side, delicate as feathers yet sharp enough to slice. The visor bore a smiling cherub, its eyes cleverly fashioned into breathing holes. But Etienne, fearing his masterpiece would tarnish in battle, coated the inside with a fine resin, sealing it smooth as glass. A fatal decision. For when Gervase wore it, on that fateful, sunny morning during a tournament at Dijon, the resin trapped the heat. His breath fogged the visor. The metal baked under the noon sun, turning the helmet into an oven for the human head. Witnesses said he fought gallantly for several minutes, unaware of his peril. Then, as the crowd cheered, he stumbled, swayed, and collapsed mid-charge, his body still upright for a moment, like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. When they pried the helmet off, it was too late. Sir Gervase had cooked himself alive in his own splendor. The story spread fast, across France, then into England and Germany, carried by merchants and monks alike. Soon, every smith in Europe was whispering the same grim reminder. Steel can guard against arrows, but not against pride. Ironically, this gruesome mishap birthed one of the earliest safety reforms in armor-making. Knights began demanding air holes near the chin, ventilation slits along the temples, and removable visors for long marches. Some even lined their helmets with thin strips of wool soaked in vinegar, a crude but effective coolant. Etienne du Lune, the blacksmith, vanished from record after that. Some said he fled to Italy to reinvent himself as an artist. Others whispered he took holy orders, repenting for his creation. But a fragment of a letter, preserved in the monastery at Cluny, tells another story. In it Etienne wrote, "The knight asked for angels, and I gave him wings of fire. Perhaps the fault was mine, or perhaps it is the way of men to die by their own ornaments." That line captures something deeply medieval, that uneasy coexistence between beauty and death, between craftsmanship and consequence. The people of that time didn't yet have a language for engineering failure. When something went wrong, they called it divine will, or curse, or simply fate. But in truth, every tragic invention carried within it a quiet seed of progress. Because from that day onward, helmets weren't just symbols of status, they became tools of survival. Every slit, hinge, and rivet told a story written in sweat, heat, and human error. And though Sir Gervase de Montfort's name faded into legend, his folly lived on in the designs of countless helmets after him. He became, unwittingly, a patron saint of ventilation. By the late 14th century, knights were testing airflow by holding feathers to their visors. Armorers learned to punch subtle holes that allowed heat to escape without compromising protection. Some even inserted tiny wax seals that melted under excess heat, a primitive warning system centuries before the idea of overheating had a word. And so, once again, the Middle Ages stumbled toward wisdom the only way it knew how, through pain. If you listen in a quiet museum today, standing before an old tournament helm, you might imagine the faint echo of Gervaise's breath inside. Not a ghost, but a reminder that behind every safe invention lies a man who didn't make it home. Now, from the clang of armor and the smell of scorched resin, we step into a darker chamber, not of war, but of medicine. For our next story concerns another invention meant to preserve life. An invention that looked almost merciful, until it began to whisper. The Black Death had left its shadow over Europe long after the plague had passed. Even in the 15th century, doctors still feared the air, the miasma, as they called it, believing disease floated invisibly, waiting to be breathed in by the careless or the cursed. Out of this fear came one of the strangest safety inventions of the Middle Ages, the healing mask. It was meant to protect, to purify the air before it reached the lungs. But like many inventions of that era, its mercy was mingled with madness. The earliest version appeared in northern Italy, a leather hood that covered the entire head, stitched tight around the neck, with a long, hollow beak jutting from the face. If you've ever seen the plague doctor's mask, you've seen its descendant. But the first prototypes were even more sinister, almost theatrical. The beak was stuffed with herbs, lavender, mint, crushed juniper, camphor, anything thought to cleanse foul air. But one design, made by a Venetian physician named Matteo Silvestri, went a step further. He believed that sound could ward off illness. So he inserted a thin reed inside the beak, which would hum gently with each breath. A low, buzzing sound, like the voice of a trapped bee. The patients found it terrifying. Imagine lying sick in bed, weak and delirious, and hearing your doctor approach, not by footsteps, but by that soft, hollow drone echoing through the night. The children called them the buzzing saints. The adults whispered they were angels of death. But the real horror wasn't the sound. It was what the mask did to those who wore it. Inside the tight leather hood, air barely circulated. Doctors often fainted after long hours tending to the dying. The herbs mixed with their own exhaled carbon dioxide, producing a dizzying, narcotic effect. Matteo himself began experiencing hallucinations, strange lights, phantom voices, visions of the air turning black and whispering my name. He documented it carefully, convinced it was part of his research. But when his apprentices found him, he was sitting upright in his chair, mask on, eyes wide open, as if still listening. He had been dead for hours. The Church, always eager to interpret meaning, declared his death a divine punishment for meddling with unseen forces. Yet others saw his invention as noble, flawed, but brave. And so, the idea of the mask spread. Soon, every major city had its own variation, beaks shorter, filters thicker, herbs replaced by sponges soaked in vinegar. Still, the side effects remained. Many doctors suffered what they called mask delirium, disorientation, loss of memory, even violent fits. In England, one physician wrote that after wearing the mask for 3 days, he heard the voice of his late wife calling to him, through the smell of thyme. But amid all this horror, a strange truth emerged. The mask worked. Not because it blocked disease, it didn't. But because it kept the doctors from touching their own faces, from inhaling the stench of decay that carried countless other infections. The accident of its success became one of the earliest forms of biological safety equipment in history. When plague returned in 1348, those who wore the mask survived longer. Not always long enough to boast about it, but long enough to be noticed. And slowly, a terrible idea began to take hold. Perhaps safety was not in comfort, but in endurance. Perhaps survival required suffering, that to be truly protected, one had to be sealed, blinded, deafened, and half suffocated by one's own invention. There's something deeply medieval about that thought, that salvation is not gentle, but earned through pain. Even centuries later, when scholars studied the journals of those early doctors, they noted a peculiar calm in their words. Many described their hallucinations not as frightening, but divine. As if the mask had opened a door between worlds. One monk wrote, "They see what lies between breath and silence. That is where death stands, waiting to be understood." And perhaps that's what these masks truly represented, not madness, but a strange intimacy with mortality. It's easy to laugh at such superstition from our modern beds, under clean sheets and filtered air. But back then, death was not a stranger. He was a houseguest, a neighbor, a frequent visitor who never bothered to knock. And so, if a man found a way to keep him waiting, even for one more night, the buzzing in his ears was a small price to pay. The healing mask, for all its terror, left behind something quietly miraculous, the concept of filtration. It was the seed that centuries later would grow into gas masks, respirators, and even the surgical masks we wear today. A gift wrapped in nightmare. Now, as the smell of mint and juniper fades, we move from the chambers of medicine to the roaring of forges, to another safety invention born of fire, and one that turned blacksmiths into living legends. Fire was both master and monster in the Middle Ages. It was the heart of every craft, the light of every home, and the silent executioner of every careless mistake. And so, it was inevitable that someone, somewhere, would try to tame it, to make fire itself safe. The man who tried was named Osric the Black Hand, a smith from the town of Wensleydale in the north of England. He earned his nickname not from birth, but from an accident, a forge mishap that left his right hand permanently charred. The flesh was dark, hard as old oak, yet miraculously, he could still move his fingers. To the locals, it looked like the hand of a demon, but to Osric, it was a reminder: safety is a luxury paid for in scars. It was around the year 1327 when Osric began experimenting with ways to make his work less dangerous. The forge fires could leap high without warning, sparks like hornets, iron glowing like trapped suns. He'd seen apprentices lose eyebrows, hair, even half their sight. So, when he heard rumors that monks in York were experimenting with treated fabrics, cloths soaked in alchemical oils to resist flame, he set out to make his own. His first attempt was simple. He boiled layers of sheep wool in a mixture of alum, vinegar, and the oil of linseed. The result was heavy, stiff, and foul-smelling. But when he held it near the fire, the cloth smoked but did not ignite. Word spread quickly. The townsfolk whispered that Osric had found a way to cheat fire. And with every telling, the tale grew grander, until nobles sent envoys, bishops sent inquiries, and Osric found himself no longer a humble smith, but an inventor of something miraculous. He worked tirelessly, making what he called the blessed apron, a thick, layered garment meant to protect blacksmiths, bakers, and anyone who dared face flame. He even embroidered crosses into the corners for good measure, convinced that holiness might improve heat resistance. When the first demonstration came, the entire town gathered in the square. Osric stood proudly before the forge, his apron tied tight. He thrust his arm into the flame, held it there for a breath, then two, and when he withdrew it, the crowd gasped. The apron was singed but unburnt. He bowed, soot-smudged and smiling. That night, they feasted in his honor. And Osric, proud, perhaps too proud, drank deep from the victory ale. By dawn, he was back at his forge, eager to refine his invention further. He soaked a new batch of aprons in a stronger mixture, doubling the alum, tripling the oil, and, in a moment of divine inspiration, adding pitch. Pitch. The most flammable substance in the town. When the forge was lit, the fumes caught almost instantly. One spark, one breath of air, and the entire workshop became a pillar of fire. Osric's apprentices tried to smother the blaze, but the oil spread faster than water could quench it. The flames leapt from the forge to the rafters, from the rafters to the thatched roofs nearby, and within an hour, half of Wensleydale was burning. They found Osric's body near the bellows, his famous apron melted into his skin. His blackened hand still clutched a lump of metal, fused forever to his palm. When the smoke cleared, the townsfolk buried him beneath the anvil, half in fear, half in reverence. The monks of York came days later to study what remained of his work. Their notes survive in fragments. His error was not of spirit, but of substance. He sought to resist the flame, and instead, he taught it to hunger. And yet, from that catastrophe came progress. The Church banned the use of pitch and linseed oil in fabric treatment, and instead encouraged experiments with clay dust and lime water. These mixtures eventually led to the first primitive forms of fire-retardant material, used in monasteries and bakeries across the kingdom. Osric became both a warning and a legend. Children were told, "Don't tempt the flame, or Osric's apron will find you." Blacksmiths, on the other hand, whispered prayers to him before lighting their forges, not as a saint, but as one of their own, who had danced too close to the fire. There's something haunting about that legacy, that even in disaster, his work saved lives. Because after Wensleydale burned, towns began enforcing fire curfews. Bell towers were fitted with iron tongues to ring at sunset, warning citizens to cover your hearths. That practice, known as curfew bell, still echoes in parts of Europe today. So, Osric's death, in a strange, poetic way, protected countless homes. Safety, in medieval times, often wore the face of tragedy. Now, as the smoke thins and the hammers fall silent, we leave the forges and return to the castles, where safety took another peculiar form, the art of designing staircases meant to save a life, or end one. You've likely seen them, the winding, dizzying staircases that curl up through medieval towers like the inside of a seashell. They feel ancient, secretive, almost romantic. But in the Middle Ages, they were not made for beauty. They were made to kill you. The spiral staircase, that elegant twist of stone, was a safety invention born from fear. Not fear of tripping, but fear of invasion. In a world where walls fell, gates burned, and men carried swords longer than your arm, survival often depended on a single architectural trick. The idea was simple. When attackers stormed a castle, they'd rush upward through narrow stairways toward the keep, the heart of the fortress. But the architects, clever devils that they were, designed those stairways to curve clockwise. This meant that the right-handed attacker, which almost every knight was, had to swing his sword from the inside of the curve, where the wall hemmed him in tight. Meanwhile, the defender above had all the space in the world to strike downward, his sword arm free on the outer curve. One staircase, dozens of dead invaders. A simple, almost invisible kind of genius. But not every spiral staircase was built with such restraint. In some castles, they became downright murderous. Take Dunrith Keep in the Scottish Highlands. Its Lord Duncan Mackervin was a man so paranoid he once accused his own horse of espionage. He ordered his mason to construct a staircase that would punish the feet of all enemies. What followed was part architecture, part sadism. The steps were uneven, some shallow, some steep, alternating without pattern. Each twist grew tighter as it climbed, until a grown man could barely turn with a sword in hand. In the wall, Duncan had narrow slits cut at ankle height, so that hidden guards could thrust daggers outward as enemies ascended. It was a death trap disguised as geometry. And it worked. During a clan raid in the winter of 1342, 12 men tried to storm the tower. By the time the first reached the top, the others lay sprawled below, tripped, stabbed, or crushed against the stone. The last survivor was found with his neck twisted against the wall, as if the staircase itself had wrung him dry. After that, Dunmartha's stairs gained a local name, the Serpent's Spine. To this day, if you climb what remains of the ruin, you can feel it, the odd rhythm of steps that never quite align, forcing your body to hesitate with every turn. It's unsettling, intentional, like a structure built by someone who distrusted even gravity. But there's another side to this story, softer and strangely touching. Because over time, the same dangerous design that kept enemies out also kept families safe within. When sieges grew long and hopeless, castle residents often sought refuge in the upper chambers. The narrow spirals became sanctuaries. Fires couldn't spread easily through them, arrows couldn't fly straight, and attackers couldn't charge more than one at a time. In a world where safety meant buying one more hour of life, a spiral staircase was a miracle of stone. And as with all medieval innovations, what began as bloodshed slowly evolved into caution. Builders began adding tiny grooves to the steps, early attempts at grip. Some even left hidden alcoves for lanterns, preventing the all-too-common deaths by candle flame or panic stumble. Centuries later, the spiral staircase became a symbol not of war, but of elegance. Churches adopted them to lead to bells and balconies, monasteries used them in libraries to reach high shelves, and sculptors turned them into works of art. Yet beneath all that grace remains its original purpose, a quiet, spiraling defense mechanism carved from fear. If you listen closely in the echo of each footstep, you can still sense the calculation behind it. How each stone was laid not for beauty, but for the desperate mathematics of survival. Perhaps that's what defines so many medieval safety inventions. They were not created out of comfort or foresight, but out of sheer, trembling necessity. Each one a whispered prayer carved into matter. Let me live through the night. And yet, while the spiral staircase protected those within, another invention emerged that promised safety for the towns outside the castle walls, an invention born from rain, fear, and the slow rot of timbered streets. It began, as so many medieval stories do, with the rain. Not the gentle drizzle of poetry, but the kind of relentless, soaking downpour that turned roads to rivers and homes to mud. For in medieval Europe, water was both blessing and curse, holy when blessed, deadly when stagnant. Before the invention of rain gutters, towns lived at the mercy of their own roofs. When it rained, thatched eaves overflowed, spilling torrents onto the streets below. The wooden beams swelled and cracked. The mortar softened. And when winter came, that water froze, split the walls, and brought entire facades tumbling down. So, around the 12th century, builders sought to tame the storm. They added stone troughs and carved channels to their roofs, the earliest gutters. Some ended in simple spouts, others, more decorative, took the shape of creatures, dragons, lions, and horned demons. The most famous, of course, were the gargoyles, grotesque guardians of the cathedrals, their mouths pouring rain like curses spat from heaven. It was an elegant idea. Divert the water away from the walls, save the structure. And it worked, at least at first. Because while these gutters saved the buildings, they doomed the streets. Imagine a medieval town after days of rain. The gutters poured their waste, not just water, but whatever filth had gathered on rooftops, pigeon droppings, soot, decaying leaves, the occasional dead rat, directly onto the roads where people walked, shopped, and prayed. The filth mixed with horse dung and kitchen refuse, forming sluggish black rivers that ran between the cobblestones. And when the sun returned, the stench rose like incense for the dead. Monks wrote of air that sickens the soul. Doctors blamed miasma, bad air, for the fevers that followed. But the truth, invisible and wriggling, lay in the fleas carried down by the water, hiding in the gutter's damp wood. By the time anyone suspected the connection, it was too late. The same invention that had protected homes from rot had helped deliver death to the doorsteps. There's a strange kind of symmetry to it, the gutters catching what heaven poured down, only to return it as something far darker. Still, the Middle Ages were nothing if not persistent. When something killed them, they simply rebuilt it differently. By the late 14th century, masons in France and England began extending the gutters farther from the walls, using long stone channels to carry water into drains or nearby streams. It was safer, though not yet sanitary. And from those crude beginnings grew the entire system of water management that would later define modern cities. But at the time, there was poetry in their superstition. They believed gargoyles didn't just spit out water, they spat out evil. That the grotesque faces were guardians, frightening away demons that might ride the rain down into holy places. And so, churches became ringed with monsters, sculpted proof that safety sometimes wears a terrifying face. In a chronicle from Rouen, a monk wrote, "The demons upon the roof howl when the rain falls, and their spittle cleanses the walls of God." That's how the medieval mind worked, half science, half prayer. Every improvement was an act of faith, every mistake a lesson in humility. And yet, even as towns learned to drain their rain, another liquid began to plague them, the waste of daily life. Chamber pots, laundry water, butcher's blood, all thrown from windows into the streets. And from that chaos came another safety measure, one both ingenious and absurd. It began not with architects or monks, but with women leaning from windows, shouting a single word before unleashing disaster. The word was "Garde-la!" A warning, shouted seconds before the waste splashed below. But that's a story best told under the cover of night, with your windows shut tight and the rain whispering outside. Because the next invention wasn't forged from fire or stone, but from sheer embarrassment. If there is one sound that defined life in a medieval city, it wasn't the tolling of church bells or the clatter of hooves on cobblestone. It was the sudden, unmistakable splash that followed a shrill cry from above. Garde-la! That cry, derived from the French gardes l'eau, meaning, beware the water, was the medieval equivalent of a public safety warning. Only the water in question was rarely water at all. More often, it was a chamber pot's worth of human waste, flung out the window to join the bubbling stew that was the medieval street. Sanitation was, for lack of a better word, creative. In an age before plumbing, the humble bucket was civilization's first line of defense. At night, people relieved themselves indoors, a mark of dignity compared to braving the freezing dark outside. But come morning, that dignity needed disposal. And so, with a quick shout and a practiced toss, the contents of a household would rain down upon the cobblestones below. Now, the problem wasn't so much the act itself. Everyone did it, but where it landed. Some unfortunate passerby might find himself baptized by accident. There were records of fights, lawsuits, and even deaths caused by a poorly aimed chamber pot. In 14th century Paris, an angry noble reportedly drew his sword after being struck by waste from an upper window. The resident above, a tailor's wife, defended herself by saying, "I did cry gardes l'eau twice, my lord. You should have minded your step." The judge sided with her. But the towns grew denser, and as the streets narrowed, the danger multiplied. Rainwater, sewage, and garbage merged into one fetid river that carved its way between homes, spreading not only stench but sickness. The safety invention of the window bucket had succeeded in keeping filth out of people's homes, and deposited it neatly into everyone else's lives. It was, in a sense, democratic. Everyone suffered equally. Cities like Edinburgh and London eventually tried to impose order. Decrees required citizens to wait until after dark to empty their pots, between the hours of 9 and 10. Some towns demanded that waste be poured only into designated channels or covered pits. But enforcing such rules was like ordering the tide not to come in. People followed them until they didn't. By the late 15th century, innovators sought to improve the practice. They developed privy chutes, narrow wooden shafts built into the side of a house, leading from upper floors to a cesspit below. The idea was simple: contain the mess, avoid the splash. In theory, a triumph of safety and sanitation. In reality, these chutes often leaked, cracked, or became clogged, transforming into vertical compost heaps that festered for years. Tenants complained of walls that oozed. One London report from 1469 describes a home where the stench was such that candles would not burn within. Still, it was progress of a sort. For medieval people, cleanliness was rarely about sterility. It was about separation. So long as the filth was not inside, the mind could rest easy. The street might be a sea of disease, but if one's own doorstep was dry, that was comfort enough. And comfort, in those times, was a fragile, precious thing. Yet the safety of the chamber pot and its window-borne flight did lead to one accidental invention: an early warning system. Citizens walking home after dark learned to hug the center of the street, where it was less likely for something to fall from above. Candlemakers sold lanterns with curved shades, not for romance, but to keep drips from hitting one's face. Even songs were written about it, light-hearted reminders that safety, in the Middle Ages, often depended on one's reflexes. One English rhyme from the late 1400s went, "If you walk by night, hold fast thy hood, for the stars rain more than good." But as cities grew and royal palaces expanded, nobles began to seek something better than buckets and warnings. They dreamed of waste disappearing without being seen. It was the birth of a quiet revolution, one that would lead, centuries later, to plumbing. And its earliest spark began in a castle, under the rule of a king who couldn't stand the smell of his own halls. The man who changed everything wasn't a scientist, nor a mason. He was a desperate servant, tasked with cleaning the royal privy. And his simple, desperate idea, to make waste flush itself away, would become one of the most important safety innovations in human history. The story of modern sanitation, and by extension, the safety of almost everyone who lived after, began in a single, drafty chamber deep inside a medieval castle. Imagine it: torchlight trembling against damp stone, the distant sound of rain on slate, and the faint, unmistakable odor of human existence. Castles, for all their grandeur, were not clean places. Behind every tapestry, beneath every banquet hall, was a secret reality of smells. Waste from kitchens, horses, and humans mixed into a constant, sour perfume that lingered in the corridors. Royalty might be closer to God, but they were never far from their own filth. To cope, medieval architects built garderobes, vertical shafts that ran down castle walls, emptying into the moat or a pit below. At first, these were considered miracles of engineering. You could relieve yourself in private, and the waste would disappear, seemingly into the earth. In truth, it often accumulated in corners of the moat, or seeped into the castle foundations, breeding rot and rats. One chronicler from the 13th century described how, during a siege, a castle was lost because its waste pit overflowed into the well. The defenders, desperate for water, drank from it. None survived. So, when King Edward I of England visited his royal palace at Harlech, and found the air so thick it made his head swoon, he ordered something extraordinary. "Let there be made a privy with running water to wash away the filth, that the air may be sweet." The task fell to a humble servant and mason known only in records as John the Plumber, one of the earliest men to bear that title. John's idea was deceptively simple. He used a network of channels that diverted rainwater from the castle roofs, directing it through the garderobe shaft. When it rained, the water would rush down, cleaning the passage and carrying the waste into the moat. It wasn't truly a flush toilet, but it was the first step toward one. In time, this innovation spread to other royal estates. Engineers improved on it by adding sloped chutes and removable stone slabs, making maintenance easier. The smell lessened, servants thanked the heavens. And the king, for once, could eat dinner without perfumed cloth pressed to his nose. The invention was hailed as a triumph of cleanliness, though it was really a triumph of comfort disguised as safety. It didn't cure disease, but it made people believe they were protected from it. And belief, in medieval times, was often the greatest defense a person could have. But the ripple effects were real. The notion that one could engineer safety, that filth and danger could be designed out of daily life, took root in Europe's imagination. Architects began to design not only for beauty or defense, but for health. Monasteries constructed washing rooms where monks cleansed before prayer. Hospitals, primitive though they were, installed rudimentary drains. And in time, the concept of flowing water became tied not just to luxury, but to sanctity. Yet, as the castles improved, the towns outside their walls remained choking in stench and sickness. Peasants still lived side by side with their animals, still dumped their buckets into the street, and still prayed not to catch the plague from their neighbors. Safety, like everything else, trickled down slowly. It's easy now to laugh at medieval sanitation, the idea of royal moats filled with waste, of chamber pots launched from windows. But each of these crude inventions was part of a slow evolution. Every attempt, no matter how foul, was born of the same dream: to make life a little more bearable, to keep one's family alive another day. For in the Middle Ages, safety was not an entitlement. It was an art form made from desperation. As centuries turned, that desperation began to shift its focus, from the filth of waste to the perils of work. Masons, blacksmiths, and carpenters were losing limbs and lives in the name of progress. So the same kind of minds who gave us the flushing privy began asking new questions. Could a man's hands be protected from his hammer? Could a worker live long enough to see his children grow? And that question, whispered in the smoky halls of a medieval workshop, would give rise to a new kind of invention. Not one to keep homes clean, but to keep people whole. A blacksmith in Saxony would be the first to try. His idea was as brutal as it was brilliant, a device made to protect life, born from a death he could never forget. The forge was the heart of the medieval village, a place of fire, noise, and creation. Inside, the air shimmered with heat, sparks danced like fireflies, and the smell of burning leather clung to the rafters. It was here, amid the hiss of quenched iron, that the line between safety and sacrifice was thinnest. The blacksmith was more than a craftsman. He was part magician, part surgeon, part priest of the flame. He bent metal to his will, shaping plows, swords, hinges, and horseshoes, all the unseen skeletons that held medieval life together. But for every masterpiece he forged, he risked his flesh. Hot iron snapped without warning. Sparks burned through sleeves. And one wrong strike could cost a finger, a hand, or a life. In the 14th century, in a small Saxon village near the Elbe River, there lived a blacksmith named Lothar Engelbrecht, known in local stories as Lothar the Iron-Handed. But his name was not a boast. It was a scar. Lothar had once been a royal armorer, forging helmets and mail for the Duke of Saxony. He had the kind of hands that could twist a bar of iron like dough. But one autumn day, as he worked the Duke's new lance tips, a hammerhead flew loose from its shaft. It struck his left hand, crushing it against the anvil. In the days that followed, the wound festered. The village healer tried herbs, prayers, and honey, but infection spread. By winter's first frost, Lothar's hand was gone. For a blacksmith, that was a death sentence. But Lothar refused to vanish quietly. He fashioned for himself an iron glove, crude, jointed, and heavy as sin. It was little more than overlapping metal plates riveted together, but it fit like armor and allowed him to grasp his hammer once again. At first, he made it only for himself. Yet his invention became the talk of the region. A passing monk wrote of him in a local chronicle, "He worketh still with a hand of metal. And in this we see that man's wit cannot match his wound." Soon, other smiths began crafting similar protective gear, first for the disabled, then for the living. The Lothar glove, as it was called, evolved into leather gauntlets lined with iron scales, worn not just by craftsmen, but by soldiers, masons, and even stable hands. It was, in essence, one of the world's first pieces of occupational safety equipment. Lothar never sought fame. He lived out his days working beside his apprentice, training him to listen to the rhythm of the forge. But his legacy endured long after his village was gone. And with it came a quiet revolution, the idea that injury need not be destiny. In a society where danger was constant, this thought was radical. Accidents were considered divine punishment or simple fate. If a man lost his hand, it was God's will. Lothar's invention suggested otherwise, that safety could be made, not prayed for. The glove became a symbol of defiance against inevitability. And it spread through Europe's craft guilds, each adapting it in their own way. Miners padded theirs with sheepskin, Fletchers stitched waxed leather to keep feathers from slicing their fingers, and stonecutters used gauntlets with rough grips for holding chisels. A small industry of safety was being born, centuries before the word existed. But as tools evolved, so too did the dangers. The medieval world was entering an age of expansion, more trade, more travel, and more machines of war. The forge that once built plowshares now built siege engines. And soon, it wasn't just smiths who needed protection. It was entire armies. The next great safety invention would emerge not from a workshop, but from a battlefield, where the line between protection and destruction blurred completely. A knight, haunted by the death of his squire, would attempt to create armor so secure that no blade could ever pierce it again. He would succeed, and in doing so, make war itself even deadlier. They called him Sir Alaric of Lüneburg, a name whispered with both awe and pity in the smoky taverns of the Rhineland. In the tapestry of medieval history, his thread was one of brilliance and tragedy. He was a knight obsessed not with conquest, but with protection. Sir Alaric had seen too many young men die for honor. His squire, a boy named Henri, had been struck down by a stray arrow in battle, a wound small enough to fit between two plates of armor. It pierced his side, and within minutes, Henri was gone. Alaric carried his body off the field himself, the child's blood soaking into the steel he had so proudly forged. That night, in his tent, the knight swore an oath beneath a flickering candle. "Never again shall a man die through the weakness of his shell." Thus began one of the strangest safety experiments of the Middle Ages. For months, Alaric secluded himself in his manor, working with smiths and alchemists to perfect what he called the invincible harness. He melted, hammered, and reforged his armor again and again, studying the angles of impact and the way light slid off curved metal. He lined the inner plates with padded wool soaked in animal fat, believing it would soften the blow of weapons. He even experimented with layered alloys, mixing iron with traces of tin, copper, and zinc to make the plates lighter and stronger. The result was extraordinary and absurd. A suit of armor weighing nearly 80 pounds, seamless and gleaming like a statue. It was said that no blade could cut it, no arrow could pierce it, and no spear could find a gap. But there was one fatal flaw: no man could wear it for long without collapsing. A visiting monk who witnessed the trial recorded, "He stood clad as an idol of Mars, but within an hour he could not rise, for his own strength was spent in bearing the armor's burden." Sir Alaric refused to give up. He trained for months, walking the castle courtyard in full plate, drenched in sweat. He forced himself to climb stairs, to mount horses, to kneel in prayer. By sheer will, he adapted, but few others could. When he finally rode into battle again, his men followed him with awe. They said he shone so bright in the sun that enemy archers mistook him for a divine vision. And for a time it worked. Arrows glanced off him like raindrops. Blades shattered on his chest. But then, as fate loves to remind, no invention is immune to irony. During a siege near Magdeburg, Alaric led a charge through flaming pitch poured from the battlements. The heat turned his armor into an oven. His men pulled him from the field alive, but barely. The very shell that had saved him from steel had trapped him in his own suffering. His skin bore burns that would never fully heal. He retired soon after, his armor sealed away behind the chapel walls. On its surface, black scorch marks still glimmered faintly, like fingerprints of fire. Yet Alaric's folly was not in vain. His work inspired generations of armorers. They studied the way his plates interlocked, how he distributed weight, and how his vision's slits angled to deflect arrows. From his experiments came the Maximilian plate armor of the 16th century, the most advanced body protection Europe would ever see before the age of gunpowder. Ironically, it was gunpowder that made his dream obsolete. No plate could withstand a musket ball. And so, just as his invention reached perfection, it was rendered useless. But the idea that one could engineer survival endured. From Alaric's forge grew the seeds of modern safety design, the understanding that protection is a balance between strength and freedom. Too heavy, and you suffocate; too light, and you die. Every helmet, glove, and shield that came after bore that lesson. And yet, as armor grew lighter, the world grew darker. Cities burned, plague spread, and the line between divine wrath and human error blurred once more. People began asking not just how to survive, but why they must suffer so at all. The next great wave of safety, innovation wouldn't come from knights or smiths, but from a quieter class, the apothecaries, the herbalists, the healers. They would invent the first medieval medicines, meant to ward off disease and protect the body from invisible forces. And behind their cures lay stories far more horrifying than any battlefield. The line between medicine and poison was a fine one in medieval Europe, and few walked it as confidently as the healers. In an age when death came cloaked in mystery, sometimes in the night air, sometimes in a rat's bite, sometimes in the priest's silence, the apothecary's hut was both a sanctuary and a gamble. You would find it at the edge of town, where the smell of boiled herbs mingled with candle smoke and damp earth. Dried roots hung from the rafters. Glass jars glimmered like jewels in the candlelight, filled with honeyed elixirs and powders that promised salvation. But look closer, and you'd see names like arsenicum, belladonna, mandragora. Each one deadly, each one essential. Because in those times, safety often came disguised as danger. The apothecary's art was built upon faith and experiment in equal measure. They believed that every poison had its counterbalance, that every illness could be outwitted if one learned nature's secret logic. If a fever burned, one must drink something that cooled. If a limb blackened, one must swallow something that burned hotter still, to chase the evil from within. And so, they mixed mercury with vinegar, ground emeralds with wine, crushed scorpions with rosewater. There was reason in their madness. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. A record from a London ledger in 1371 notes: "A woman of St. Mary Parish, having taken the draught of silver water, did sleep for 3 days and wake clean of fever, though her hair did not grow again. She survived, bald but alive. Others weren't so lucky." Arsenic, for example, was a favorite ingredient in purifying tonics. It gave the skin a healthy flush and killed parasites, before it killed the host. Belladonna, or beautiful woman, dilated the eyes and brought color to the cheeks, but one drop too many and the heart forgot to beat. Still, people came. They came because healers spoke softly, lit their rooms with warm light, and made promises the church could not. A prayer might save your soul, but an apothecary might save your child. And in that fragile hope, Europe's first safety science was born, a dangerous kind of chemistry that blurred the line between help and harm. The most feared disease of all, the plague, turned healers into desperate inventors. When death swept through towns like wind through dry grass, they created plague waters, mixtures of vinegar, sage, and rue believed to drive off contagion. They wore beaked masks stuffed with lavender, thinking the sweet air would filter the sickness. In truth, it was the mask itself, the distance it created, that kept them safe. One Venetian doctor, Giorgio di Lapis, wrote in 1437, "I have lived while thousands fell because I trust not the air, but the glass." He meant the thin glass lenses over his eyes, perhaps the earliest use of what we might call safety goggles. Even among superstition, there were sparks of genius. Every strange charm, every foul tonic, every bubbling cauldron held a seed of scientific method, trial and error under candlelight. It was the messy, often fatal beginning of modern pharmacology. But the true horror of medieval medicine wasn't its failures. It was how much people believed in it. For belief, when wrapped in fear, can make any danger seem like salvation. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the apothecaries had grown wealthy. They kept shops near churches and town squares, their shelves lined with silver scales and handwritten tomes. Their craft was no longer folk wisdom, it was commerce. And wherever profit entered, deception followed. Some began to sell unicorn horn powder for protection against poison, mummy dust from Egypt to heal wounds, and dragon's blood to strengthen the heart. None of it was real. But it didn't matter. People bought safety because it was the one thing no one could ever truly own. The world was changing, trade routes opening, knowledge spreading, and dangers multiplying. Every voyage, every battlefield, every crowded market was a new experiment in survival. And so the dream of safety followed humanity like a shadow, taking on new shapes, new inventions, new fears. In the centuries that followed, this dream would leave the dim hut of the apothecary and move into the bright workshops of alchemists, men who sought not to heal the body, but to master the elements themselves. They would forge glass that could withstand fire, steel that could bend without breaking, and one day, quite by accident, create the first protective mask designed for human survival. But before that miracle came the explosion. By the late 15th century, Europe was trembling on the edge of enlightenment, though it didn't know it yet. The Black Death had burned its way through the continent, kingdoms were rebuilding, and human curiosity, starved by fear for so long, began to boil again. In candlelit basements and echoing monastery workshops, a new kind of dreamer emerged, the alchemist. They weren't just men of science, not yet, but poets of the possible. They sought to turn lead into gold, cure aging, summon pure light from fire, and capture God's breath in a bottle. Their tools were primitive: bellows, copper pans, glass flasks, and the occasional reckless imagination. Their reward? Sometimes brilliance. Often explosions. And from one such explosion, safety itself was reborn. In 1492, the same year Columbus set sail west, an Italian scholar named Alessandro della Torre was conducting an experiment in Florence. His ambition was to create a liquid of eternal purity, something that could cleanse not only metals but the human spirit. What he made instead was a small disaster. He mixed mercury, sulfur, and saltpeter in a copper vessel, a combination that, in retrospect, was one prayer away from catastrophe. When the mixture ignited, a column of thick yellow smoke filled his chamber. The fire burned his robe but spared his life. He stumbled out coughing, eyes streaming, his beard singed to ash. And yet, as he gasped for air in the courtyard, he noticed something remarkable. The thin layer of cloth he tied around his face, a simple habit to block the stench, had blackened, but he had not inhaled the worst of the fumes. The cloth had saved him. He later wrote in his notes, "The mouth's veil did take the poison and turn it to soot. I live, though the air itself did rage against me." Thus was born the first recorded safety mask, not as invention, but as accident. Alessandro began to refine the idea, experimenting with layers of linen soaked in vinegar and honey. He discovered that the fabric, when damp, trapped more of the vapors that otherwise stung his lungs. Other alchemists followed his example, wearing scarves dipped in herbal solutions to shield themselves from smoke. By 1500, the breathing veil had spread through Europe's hidden workshops, its purpose understood but never officially named. It was protection, quiet, practical, and deeply human. The mask would later evolve into something more recognizable during the age of gunpowder and plague doctors. Those iconic long-nosed masks filled with herbs. They were the children of Alessandro's experiment, shaped by fear and necessity. But in that Florentine chamber, the idea was new and radical. The notion that a piece of fabric could stand between life and death was, to medieval minds, almost sorcery. And perhaps it was. Because safety in those days wasn't just about tools or inventions. It was about faith, faith that the world's chaos could be tamed by human hands. That one could prepare for danger, instead of simply enduring it. It was a faith born of burns, disease, and heartbreak, the kind of faith that could make a man wear cloth against fire. Alessandro never found his elixir of eternal purity. But he did find something far greater, the seed of modern protective science. He would die old, not from poison or plague, but from sleep, his notebooks filled with sketches of masks, gloves, and strange bottles labeled, "Air Safe." In time, his students would scatter across Europe, carrying his notes. One of them, a German alchemist named Klaus von Münster, took the idea of protection even further. He wondered, if one could protect the lungs from poison, could one also protect the eyes, the ears, even the mind from danger? He believed human senses were fragile gates, and that safety meant not only surviving the world, but filtering it. It was the first whisper of a philosophy that would outlive the Middle Ages entirely. That to feel safe is as important as being safe. And so, from soot and fire, from broken glass and burned fingers, emerged a truth that echoed through centuries. Every great invention in human history was born from a single wish. Let this never happen again. As the alchemists passed into legend, their crude experiments gave rise to the earliest scientists. Safety would leave the monasteries and forges behind and step into the bustling streets of Renaissance cities, where builders, sailors, and explorers would demand protection from the new perils of an expanding world. The stage was set for the next chapter in our midnight journey, one filled with sails, storms, and the inventions that tried, and often failed, to keep men alive at sea. The sea has always been both muse and monster. It sang softly to fishermen at dawn and swallowed fleets by dusk. It brought trade, adventure, and kingdoms, but it also demanded tribute, one shipwreck at a time. For every sailor who kissed his child goodbye at the harbor, a part of him knew that the ocean might never return him. In the medieval world, the sea was not yet something humans believed they could conquer. It was God's unpredictable mirror, reflecting both providence and punishment. And yet, despite this reverence, man still tried to make peace with it, by invention, by desperation, and sometimes, by absurdity. Among the strangest of these inventions was an early attempt to cheat drowning itself, the first medieval life jacket. It began not in a royal court or a scholar's chamber, but on a lonely coast in Norway, around the year 1380. There, fishermen braved the icy North Sea in narrow wooden boats that creaked like old bones. When storms rose without warning, and they often did, the men tied bladders of air taken from sheep or seals around their chests. Some wore belts of cork bark, others stitched inflated animal stomachs beneath their tunics. They looked ridiculous, like puffed-up scarecrows of the sea. But sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. The Norse sagas whisper of a man named Hakon Tryggvason, who survived a wreck by clinging to his belt of dried kelp and inflated pig bladders. When he washed ashore, half dead and laughing, the villagers called him the man who wore the air. Soon, word spread, and crude flotation belts began appearing in trading ports along the coasts of Denmark and Scotland. But human invention, especially in the medieval age, was rarely without tragedy. By the 1400s, sailors aboard merchant ships began to modify Hakon's idea. Instead of animal bladders, they used pitch-sealed leather sacks filled with air or oil, fastened by ropes around the torso. They believed oil floated better than air, an understandable but disastrous misunderstanding. When the sacks burst or leaked during a storm, the wearers often drowned faster than those who had trusted only their limbs. Worse still, some jackets absorbed water, turning into weighted vests that dragged their owners beneath the waves. An English mariner's log from 1437 records one such scene. They leapt into the grey, crying "God save us," yet their leather coats did pull them down like stones. The sea had no need of anchors that day. The attempt to outwit the sea had backfired. But the dream refused to die. In Venice, a city that lived half on land, half in water, shipbuilders began experimenting with cork as a buoyant material. Cork was light, plentiful, and blessedly immune to the salt. Monks in the Arsenal di Venezia workshop were said to have devised a float cloak, a sleeveless vest lined with cork blocks sewn into linen. Sailors mocked it, calling it the coward's robe, for no self-respecting man of the sea admitted fear of drowning. But those who wore it sometimes lived to be mocked again. By 1485, similar cork vests appeared in Spain and Portugal, worn by explorers charting the edges of the known world. When storms came and ships split upon reefs, these odd vests occasionally saved lives, and more importantly, stories. Survivors spoke of floating for hours, watching lightning crawl over the black water, feeling the weight of their lives held up by something so simple as bark. One chronicler from Lisbon wrote, "The sea was cruel, yet I did not sink. I owed my life to the tree that grew on dry land." Still, the medieval life jacket was far from perfect. The cork cracked in cold, the linen tore under strain, and the arrogance of captains kept the invention from being widely adopted. Many preferred to trust fate, or God, over fabric. To wear a cork vest was to confess fear, and fear was the sailor's greatest sin. So, for centuries, the sea kept winning. It would take until the 18th century for the idea of a life jacket to re-emerge in refined form, stitched by naval engineers, standardized by empires. But the medieval attempts mattered. They were clumsy prayers against chaos. They were humanity's first whispers to the waves. We will not drown quietly. When you trace the history of safety, from the blacksmith's gloves to the alchemist's mask, from plague charms to cork vests, you find not a tale of progress, but of persistence. Every medieval safety invention was born of pain. Each device was a scar made visible. And behind them all, one trembling hope, that human life, however fragile, could be preserved. The fisherman tying bladders to his chest. The mason sanding down his gloves. The doctor pressing herbs into a mask. Each of them was inventing not only for survival, but for mercy, for themselves and for the strangers who would come after. The sea may never have been tamed, but those early dreamers gave it something new to fear. a species too stubborn to stop trying. If you've been drifting along this long medieval night with me, you've likely felt it, the slow rhythm of invention and failure, of courage stitched to fear. Every safety measure, every device, every odd, dangerous idea, it was a candle in the dark, flickering against a storm that never quite ended. And as we near the end of our tale, there's one last invention worth visiting, not the most famous, but perhaps the most quietly heroic. It wasn't armor or medicine or law. It was a candle. In the late 1400s, when towns began to stretch into cities, the medieval night was a thing of terror. Fire meant warmth, but it also meant ruin. A single spark could devour a street, a parish, a century's worth of parchment. And so, monks, artisans, and apothecaries began a strange, stubborn quest to make a candle that wouldn't start fires. They called it the sleeping flame. It was meant to light the long hours of study without fear that a drowsy scholar or monk might tip it over. It was an attempt to make fire safer, a contradiction as ancient as humanity itself. The first attempt came from a Benedictine monastery in Burgundy. The brothers mixed beeswax with crushed alabaster and ground chalk, hoping to slow the burn. It did, but the smoke turned black and heavy, coating the ceiling with soot. One monk described it as like burning the bones of saints. A century later, in England, an apothecary tried again, this time using whale oil thickened with honey and a small measure of salt. It burned beautifully, for 1 hour. Then, without warning, it exploded, sending bits of glass and wax flying across his small shop. The record of this attempt survives in the margins of his ledger, smudged with ash. The safer I make the flame, the wilder it grows. And yet, in Venice, always Venice, someone found a kind of answer. A glassmaker named Lucia di Montreal, said to be both an alchemist and an artist, created a glass candle vessel with double walls. Between them she poured water, so that if the flame fell or spilled, it would meet its own drowning. The candle inside burned calm and soft, and when the flame reached the glass's lip, the heat melted the upper wax gently into the water below. No fire. No danger. Just light. Lucia sold her invention to scholars, physicians, and sailors, anyone who feared the unpredictable friendship of fire. She died in obscurity, of course, as most inventors of safety do. But her candle, her water flame, was copied throughout Europe for a century. It's poetic, isn't it? That in an age of swords and plague, one of the last true safety inventions was about gentleness. A quiet light that refused to kill. Safety, in the medieval sense, was never about perfection. It was about lessening pain, not erasing it. It was about turning catastrophe into inconvenience, and hoping God would forgive the rest. And as I tell you this now, as you lie perhaps half dreaming, I can't help but think how little has changed. We, too, still live beside danger. We build walls against our fears, design locks, alarms, vaccines, seat belts, circuit breakers, and yet the feeling remains. That we are fragile. That we must keep inventing. The candle of the Middle Ages has become the bulb. The plague mask, a surgical respirator. The cork vest, a bright orange life jacket. But at the heart of it all lies the same trembling question humanity has whispered since the first fire caught in a cave. Can I make this world safe enough to sleep in? As the candle of our story burns low, the night grows quieter. The medieval streets have emptied. The tinkers and masons have gone home. In the silence, you might still hear the hiss of the blacksmith's forge, the creak of a cork vest drying by the fire, the soft hum of a monk grinding herbs for his plague mask. They are gone now, long gone. But their fears built our comfort. Their tragedies built our safety. And though we often forget them, they were the quiet architects of peace. So, if you ever light a candle before sleep, think of Lucia's water flame. Think of the mason's gloves. Think of the men who wore air to survive the sea. And whisper a small thank you to the nameless inventors who made the dark just a little less cruel. This is where the story ends, and your night continues. Let your mind drift now through centuries of quiet progress, through cathedrals and cobbled streets, through the steady hum of invention that never quite stops. History is not loud. It's a soft, persistent flame, one that has kept us all alive through every terrible and beautiful age. Sleep well, traveler. You've made it safely through the Middle Ages.